I always find it fascinating how people in non-profit organisations think about management and financial management. And I think there's a wide range of people with different views about how you feel about it. And I think I came across two quotes not that long ago that for me kind of encompassed the position of how we are in non-profit organisations. The first one was by Peter Drucker, who's a management guru who you may have heard of. And it's this one, you can see it on the screens here, about management being a dirty word for those involved in the non-profit organisations, non-profit sector, and trying to be free of this taint of commercialism. I like this quote very much because it symbolises for me how the non-profit sector is at one end of a spectrum. And it's one end where we have a lot of passion, we have a lot of motivation, we have people with ideas. And those people are the real core of a lot of what we do in the non-profit sector. And so what I like about this too is the fact that it gives that sense of being free from commercialism. And I know a lot of people join the sector because they say, I don't want any more of that commercial stuff. I've had some experience of that, I don't want it anymore. It limits us a bit too, doesn't it? Because it's saying, as well as all of that, we might say all of those good things that come from management and financial management tend not to be there, or we don't want them to be there. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is this one by Andrew Bibby, who's a journalist, and he's talking much more about dynamic organisations, professionals who can do all of these business-like activities, primarily to make sure that an organisation meets its corporate objectives. That's what it's about. So two ends of a spectrum. Now, I find this as interesting for a number of reasons, partly because I come from a background where I have a foot in both camps in a way, because I'm trained as an accountant, that's one of my hats. The other hats, I trained as a development worker, I've got a degree in development management, and I come largely with experience of a charitable sector, but also the international development sector. That's perhaps where I've got most experience. So I can see the passionate side, I can also see the need that funders often expect us to have in the sector for organisations to be well managed, for them to have good financial reports and clear systems. So a mixture of the two. And the organisations I work with are some very large ones, some very small ones, some community-based organisations, and a lot across the board in the middle. So a range of different organisations. And I find in my work that both of these ends of the spectrum are very common. Some people go to the extreme on the Bibby end, to use a shorthand, and some go to the extreme on the Drucker end, to use another shorthand. I'm not sure that either of these reflect the individual. I should say this really as a disclaimer. Either of these quotes necessarily reflect the experience or views of Drucker or Bibby, but they're the ones who were quoted by them. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're going to do in the next half hour, 40 minutes or so. These are the things we've got lined up to do. Firstly, we'll look at an overview. We've done that of attitudes to management and financial management. And then I'll start to go through a few of the things that we tend to want to have in non-profits and charities where we have financial management skills. How would we want a non-profit organisation to look if it had good financial management capacity within that organisation? So we'll look at some of the specific tasks and some of the organisational aspects that are a little bit wider as well. We'll then have a look at some of the tools for developing this financial management capacity within organisations, and we'll look at one example of financial management that affects a lot of organisations. I've called it core costs. I don't know if that's a term you know in Canada. You might call it overheads or admin expenses. Things like that would be common names too. And programme costs, the activities that you're actually delivering, would be the other side of that. So those two comparisons of costs there. Okay, so let's have a look to start with then at the key skills that are required by organisations. And I find organisations, when they're building financial management capacity, look at financial management and people sometimes say this to me, well, okay, it's good to have financial management, but we're about delivering the programme. They're perhaps more akin to Drucker's ideas in that way. So what's financial management got to do with us? Why do we need it? And I'd want to say very strongly to them, if you don't have good financial management in your organisation, if you've not got the capacity to deliver on that, your programme of activities, whatever you're trying to do, will be diminished as a direct result of that. So it's not just about financial management being there to have good accounting. It's actually saying too, I've discovered, that if we don't have it, our programme of activities will be diminished. It won't be as good as it could be. And I don't know about the organisations you work in, but I find often that some of the ways we try and deliver better and better programme activities, it's very difficult. You know, they're often grey areas. They're areas where we know some of what we like to do, but sometimes it's really difficult to know how you improve the level of delivery of your services. Financial management is much easier in many ways. So if you can improve the level of the programme through doing better at financial management, that's a relatively easy way of getting the programme to be more effective. And that's what we're about. That's what we'd want to do. So I'm going to have a look at this capacity building through financial management and look at what an organisation should have in place. I've got a couple of slides I'm going to look at related to this. This is the first one. And this one I call specific tasks of financial management capacity building. The specific tasks of having strong financial management in an organisation. Now, these are tasks that all charities and non-profits need to have in one way or another. Indeed, I would go further and say for most organisations, these are specific tasks that need to be in place, not just charities and non-profits. Let me just quickly go through what they are. First one, planning and budgeting, deciding what the objectives are, putting them together, and then putting them together in a financial format, budgeting. Okay, so we've put the budget together and do that. Big organisations have got this really down to a fine art. Smaller organisations, medium-sized organisations, perhaps do it. I think often smaller organisations do it because funders say you've got to do it, so we have no choice if that's the case. Planning and budgeting. Second one, accounts record keeping. You'll see I've got a photograph here of my office, and that's kind of the kind of record keeping we sometimes think of, although mostly now we've got it all on computer instead, which is a good thing. Nitty-gritty. So if you're a finance person, or if you're in a smaller organisation where you've just got one or two staff, you might well do that. Again, big organisations would say we've got not just one person, but maybe a whole team of people who do that accounting record keeping. Keeping the nitty-gritty of the receipts, the invoices, recording them, and having the kind of basic material that you can then put together to present the financial reports. So number 3 is the financial reporting to our organisation for our own information. We need to know what's going on and we need to know what the cost of things is. We also need to report to funders, to donors, people who've given us money, and we need to report to our partners or beneficiaries, people who we're working with. Often kind of that's left out of the equation, but really important to tell people what we've done with the money we've raised on their behalf. So that's their money we're raising, and we need to tell them how we're doing. Let's report to them. And then the fourth one is the thing I would describe as financial controls or internal controls, the kind of things that you have in an organisation. Again, bigger organisations have got this very well organised. Smaller organisations tend to perhaps need to do more work on it sometimes, varies a little bit. It's things like what we might describe as procedures or systems for financial management, So if you're buying things, if you're authorising expenditure, there'd be an internal control about that. If you're signing cheques, there might be an internal control, financial control about that. So these are the 4 things we'd want to see in place for all organisations. So if you're saying, what do I need as a kind of primary financial skills and financial routines in the organisation, these are the 4. There aren't other ones. These are the 4 that we would tend to go with. Okay, up to there. Yeah? See a few nods. Great. Okay, and then around about that, we have the annual audit, the inspection of the records, inspection of the organisation, an external audit, we might call it, people from outside coming in, looking at how we're doing. And they would help us to keep all of these 4 in good order. And that would be really good if we can do that. Okay, so let me just go on to the next slide. And we've got those 4 things in the middle of this slide again. And we've got round that external audit. Now, I did some work, partly for this book, and partly for other things as well, and general experience, by interviewing quite a lot of people from non-profit organisations in different parts of the world, some large organisations, some small. And what I was trying to find out in that was, what are the ingredients that we need in an organisation, not only to have those basic 4 things in place, but to have all sorts of other things that will help us become an effective organisation. So to do our financial management better, but also to help us do our programme of activities better as well. Both of those is really what we want to find out from this. And I found there were 10 key things that we would want to do. And I've grouped these together into 5 groups of 2 things each. And I'll just quickly go through those and see what they are. Okay, I should say perhaps that these blocks, these 5 blocks that we've got here, don't refer necessarily directly to the ones in the middle. So they're kind of perhaps ones that would move around. They might refer to a bit of the things in the middle, or they might be independent from that. They're not directly related to those particular 4 pieces of the jigsaw in the middle there. I should just mention that. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the management committee, what we might call the board, the trustees, the governing body, whatever name we give them, the volunteers who lead our organisation, who take responsibility for the organisation. That's what I've described here as the management committee. And 2 things in that, really crucial ones. We need somebody who's got suitable experience on finance. We might call that person the treasurer. We'd want somebody who's got the experience. Might not necessarily be a qualified accountant, but they need to have some experience and need to give what's in there a high profile. Give the financial side of the organisation a high profile. I know lots of organisations, particularly small ones, find it really, really difficult to get those people who can take that role as a volunteer, trustee, board member in organisations. So we want somebody who's got that experience. We also want other members of the board who can understand some of the basics about financial management. So we'd want to see that in there. Again, quite difficult to find that. Sometimes the finance person, the treasurer, is the only person on the board who's got that expertise. Really important that that person can be challenged and that somebody else has some idea of what's going on financially. And some of the work I do is around training people who haven't got the expertise, but they can learn that expertise as they go along. Okay, that's the first one of the 5. The second one is about the finance staff. We need trained, competent people. If we're very small, it might be the treasurer who's doing the hands-on work. If we're a big organisation, we might have a whole department doing this, and we might have people who are qualified accountants as well, and a whole team of people who've got experience of financial stuff. They need to be trained, they need to be competent, need to be able to perform as they are required to in the size of organisation. And then the second one of these 2 is that finance staff are able to communicate well with non-financial staff. I can't overestimate that enough, because people are saying to me often when I'm doing training or consultancy work, people who are not accountants, non-financial people, They'll say to me, my finance people talk to me, but I can't understand what they're saying to me. I don't know whether you've got that same experience, but that's very, very common. They talk to me in jargon, they talk to me in riddles, I can't understand them. And I also find when I'm working with finance people, they always say to me, oh, well, those people who do the program stuff, they don't understand us, they don't know what we're all about. And equally, there's a kind of mismatch. Part of the research I did for this book was finding out what are the different personality types that you need to be a finance person and a non-finance person. Fascinating stuff, because you find different personality types are drawn to different types of work. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but some of the ongoing research I'm doing now is around this area of how people communicate about financial management within organisations. So if anybody's got any experience about that and would like to help with this research, I'd be delighted to meet you. So do talk to me about that. Okay, so those next two. The financial information ones, these will come as no surprise. We need up-to-date, accurate financial information. We need it to be in a user-friendly format. I know a lot of organisations struggle like mad with this because they say, we do it, and we do it because it's in the format that finance people want to see. So you folks who are not financial people, you just have to put up with what we've got. We don't necessarily tailor it for those people who are non-financial. We need to do that. And sometimes it's a case of summarising what you're providing. So I know if you go to a board meeting with 10 pages of detailed financial information, the board members will just switch off. They won't look at it. I'm used to looking at financial information. I'm a member of a board, and if I see it, I switch off. You know, I just think, well, I can't cope with all this information. There's too much of it here. So sometimes what we need is a summary of it. Maybe on one page, I would say, is ideal for a board meeting. And then if you want more information, you ask for it and you get it. Okay, so that's another sort of area. Fourth of the 5 areas is this organisational culture, how organisations are. And again, a key point of this was what I call here the leadership team, the director, the CEO, whatever we call the person who's in charge of the organisation, whether it be a staff member, which often it is in larger organisations, or if not, maybe if it's just purely volunteers who are in the organisation, whoever's perhaps the chair of the board, somebody of that sort. So what we'd see is that person prioritises and promotes financial management. Okay, so they're saying this is important. I think a very good test for a CEO is how they do personally with their own financial report. So if, for example, they go out on a trip somewhere and have lots of receipts, they've paid money out, how quickly do they present their information to the finance team? Very interesting question, that. You may like to think about that one and know in your organisation how people do. It's a litmus test of how it works, I think. But we need people who promote an organisation and prioritise it financially. I know one organisation that I did some work with, and they were a brilliant organisation when I first got involved with them. And they had a CEO who was really on the ball. Funders were queuing up to fund them. They said, you are brilliant at all this financial management stuff. We love your programme. You're doing a really grand job. It's really effective. You have lots of good outcomes of the organisation's programme. We'll give you money. And she had lots of money given to her. After a while, she decided she was going to leave the organisation. And what happened? She was replaced by somebody who hadn't got that same expertise, or really not the same interest in the organisation's financial management. And over a period of about 18 months, the organisation got really a reputation for not worrying too much about this financial stuff. It was the programme that was important. She was a Drucker person, this person. She wasn't a Bibby person at all. And she said, no, I'm going to delegate all of this to the finance team. We've got a brilliant finance team. They'll do it all. And she did this, and the organisation decided that it was going to encourage her to carry on doing this. The board was supporting her. Said, yeah, finance isn't that important. And over that period of 18 months, 2 things happened. One was that funders saw that the financial management of the organisation got really very poor. And over a period, several of the funders said, we're not going to fund you any longer. We can't guarantee you're going to give us the reports that we want. That was the first thing that happened. And the second thing that happened was to say there was a fraud in the organisation. The person who was the head of the accounting side of the work said, committed a fraud. And they didn't even find this out for about 9 months or so. And then eventually a firm of auditors came in and did an audit and then found that this fraud was going on. They had some really, really bad publicity as a result of this. It got into the papers and so on. And eventually the organisation got to the point where it was nearly collapsing. And I would attribute that to that CEO's role of saying, this is not important. That was a key factor in that particular example. Okay, so really important stuff. Financially aware programme staff, non-finance staff. So people have got some idea about finances, and a lot of the training work I do is with people who are non-financial people, trying to give them those basic skills. One of the key things there, I think, is not to make people, or not to try and make people into accountants. Most people who are non-finance people don't want to become accountants, definitely not. So what they need is a working knowledge. They need enough to kind of get by with. And if they've got that, that's enough. That's sufficient. And we'll have a look in the session a bit later on about how some of those training things work, and how that training can work with non-financial people. Okay, that's number 4. Number 5 of these 10 factors is external relationships. Awareness of what could go wrong, what we might describe as risk management. And I know lots of organisations, certainly big ones, have become a bit obsessive even about risk management. It's really important, and rightly so. It is important for us to look at risk and see what it is. Smaller organisations sometimes find that very difficult to kind of get to grips with all that. And I know a lot of the work I do with international NGOs, if you talk about risk management, you'll get a blank look. Certainly in Africa or Asia, that would be the case often, that, yes, risk, I kind of understand that. But if you talk to them about what could go wrong, they would know exactly what you're talking about. So this is one of the external areas, what we're thinking is likely to go on. And then the last one is having strong relationships with funders, with beneficiaries, partners, whoever we work with, in terms of our financial management. Okay, so a whole range of things there. The ones around the outside are organisational factors. We might look at those in quite a different way to what we see in the middle there, which we just have to do. The ones on the outside, perhaps we have a choice over some of them, but if we don't do some of them, I think what we find is that really things can very easily go wrong. Now, if we were to say which are the most important of these 10 factors, I wonder what you would say. Perhaps giving you a few hints already, the ones I think are the most important. Any views? Which would you say is the most important one?
For the leadership team, if it doesn't come from there, then it won't infiltrate through the company.
Great, thank you. Yes, that's certainly one of my top ones. I would say that's a key one. Yes, I will. It's the leadership team one. This one in the top part under organisational culture, that the leadership team promote and prioritise financial management. Any others? Yeah.
Up-to-date financial information.
Yeah. If we don't get that, a lot of the decision making is a bit sort of dubious. We can't necessarily make good decisions, so really important to have that. I would say the other one, which I think is really important, is the communication of financial staff to non-financial staff. Because sometimes in organisations people say to me, I don't really know what's going on. My finance team can't talk to me about finance in a way I can understand. What am I to do? I think I would say to them 2 things really. One is, learn a bit more about it, that will be good, but also try and encourage your finance team to become better communicators. See if you can kind of improve that way of working that they have. So those are key ones we'd want to see that are there. Now, I've done what I call a review of financial systems, which I'll put on the screen, which is on my website, which the details are on there. And on that review of financial systems is a group of questions for each of these 10 categories and the ones in the middle as well. If you want to sort of see how your organisation is doing financially, you can go through this review of financial systems and just go through and check how you're doing and perhaps rate yourself. Or if you're working with partner organisations, you might want to do it for them too and just see how they're doing and see if things could be improved. And the idea is it gives you a minimum standard that you might want to aspire to, and then a question, and then you can rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 in this category. The ones who are kind of rated 5 tend to be ones who are finding some of these areas very, very positive. The ones who are at the lower end of the scale, perhaps less so. Okay, so that's the idea. And it's available in different languages as well. If you want to use it in French or English or Spanish or Arabic, there's a version of that on the website too. Okay, so it's a bit like this, I think. It's juggling plates. How the circus people are when they put plates like this. I think if we're managing within an organisation, I've often felt very much like this person juggling the plates, because I'm trying to keep all of these things going at the same time and that none of them crash. I'm trying to do that. But I've got a whole load of other things I'm also trying to manage, not just the financial management. So it feels a really tricky thing to get all the things working at once. And sometimes we don't always manage it, but that's what we need to aspire to get to that point. Okay, one other thing on this, and this is again related to the work I did in looking at organisations and saying, what are the things that we can do that will help organisations to improve their financial management capacity? How can they get better at it? And these are things I've come across, and some of them I've used directly myself, other ones I've seen other people use. And the idea of this is that it's a selection of things that you might want to pick and choose from. And in the book there's details about all of these. But the place on the top right-hand side and the bottom left-hand side have deliberately been left empty because you might want to add other ones in there. You might want to have things that you've discovered yourself that will work really well. Okay, most of them are fairly obvious, like giving encouragement, asking questions, finding good communicators amongst the finance staff, those sorts of things. One or two perhaps are less obvious, things like confidential tutoring. I found sometimes if you've got an organisation where there's a manager or a CEO, a director, who's not very good at finance but doesn't care to admit that they're not very good at finance, they don't want anybody really to know about this, and wouldn't be the sort of people who would go on a course about finance because everybody would find out that they don't really know about it. You may know one or two people like this. But if we find that's the case, one way of actually helping is to give that person some sort of confidential tutoring on the basics of financial management, how to have a working knowledge of what you need to know. Now again, not to make the person accountant, but to help them to say, yeah, I can deal with a budget report, I can look at some of these internal controls and they make sense, I know why we need them. And what they find often if you do that is a lot of it is common sense, it's not really difficult stuff, but they still need to feel confident to be able to do that. Really important in that way. Okay, I'm going to leave that with you. I say there's more information about that in the book, and do ask me, as you see me, if any of those aren't obvious, do ask me, and I'm very happy to explain a bit more about any of those in more detail. So I want to just do one more thing, and that's just have a look at this area that we face within the charity and non-profit sector about what I describe as core costs. We might describe as admin overheads, we might describe them as indirect costs or non-program costs, those sorts of things. And again, part of the work I did was finding out what organisations do about this. I seem to have come up with a bit of a blank on. Let me see if I can. No, I'll just tell you what these are. So 5 things that we find are there for covering core costs. 5 strategies that we might say are important for non-profit organisations. And these, interestingly, are ones that I looked at, and 2 people way back in 1989 in Geneva, we did some research on this. I think that was really the first key research that had been done on it. Ferdinand Vincent and Pierre Campbell were the 2 people in 89. And more recently, somebody called Julia Unwin did some work on it, and she came up with more or less the same list. And these are 5 things that non-profit organisations, charities, need to sort of be aware of to cover these overhead costs. Let me just tell you what they are. First one, if you've got a funder who gives you an admin allowance, some sort of proportion of the total, you use that. That's the key one that you might use. Okay, number 1. Number 2, reduce the overhead cost to the minimum. Now, most non-profits I know have already done that. There's not much more scope for doing that. I know when I first started working at Oxfam, there was a very interesting psychological way of trying to encourage staff to cut back on photocopying. And what they put there was a notice above the photocopy, and it said, if you take this photocopy, the cost of the photocopy will feed a child in Uganda for a day. Goodness, I thought, I can't take this photocopy. You know, I just can't take it. So I wrote it out myself. I just copied it out. I thought, I can't do that. I can't be responsible for this. Very interesting psychology. I'm not sure how well it worked. And after a while, I've been there for a few months, they took the notice down. So I suspect maybe it wasn't working so well. But a very interesting way of doing it. Okay, that's second, reduce the core costs. Thirdly, use your own funds, raise some funds yourself, and again, lots of non-profits do that. They take their own funding, raise their own funding and use that. Some limits for some organisations, depending on whether the funding is restricted for a particular purpose or not. Some can do that, some find it very difficult. Fourthly, find a donor who will cover some of those central overhead costs. If you've got somebody who can do that, you're very fortunate. You need to treasure that funder, look after them, make them feel good about themselves, because they're doing a fantastic job if they'll do that. Okay, so admin allowance, reducing the core cost to a minimum, using your own funds or raising funds, finding a funder or a donor that covers those costs. And then the last one, which perhaps for big organisations is already well in place, I describe it as an accounting solution. And it's allocating those costs, those overhead costs, as far as you can to programme costs, to make sure that what you're doing in your accounting is fair to yourself, that you're not putting in things in the overhead costs budget that really are related to programme. And I think for big organisations, they've generally done a lot of, well, I call it fancy footwork in doing this. You know, they've worked out really, really well how to do that and have maybe a full-time person or even a team of people in some organisations making sure that works well. In smaller, medium-sized organisations, there's often still a way to go, I find, in trying to make sure that you're being fair to yourself. You're not putting together some of these core costs, overhead costs that relate to really programme. Things like, for example, telephone bills. Do we put the telephone bills together and say, well, that's really admin? When we look at them in a bit more detail, we find actually 95% of those telephone calls relate directly to organisational programme costs, not to admin at all. So looking at those sort of areas. So finally then, 3 things that we get as benefits for doing all this and building our financial management capacity. First one is we get better likelihood of funding. Our funding possibilities are much more likely to work if we've got good financial management capacity. So really important from that point of view. Secondly, we've got stronger decision making and stronger financial management generally within the organisation. Great to have, helps us to make better decisions on a whole range of issues, but also on our programmes and our activities. And thirdly, we improve the programme effectiveness because we've got stronger financial management capacity. Really important, that one, because we don't often link financial management with having better programmes. But the experience I have, the experience of the work I did in researching this, was proving that time and time again. If we get better financial management, our programme is better. If we get poorer financial management, our programme isn't so good. So not only is it giving us good accounting, it's giving us more effective programmes. So really important from that point of view as well.